Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're very excited to be introducing to you our new program in the BSc and LLB. I'm Tim Boembrink. I'm the Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning in the Faculty of Science. And joining me today is Dr. Ryan Whalen, who is in the law faculty and the coordinator of the program, Professor David Lee, who's in the Department of Chemistry, Dr. Carolyn Dingle, who's in the School of Biological Sciences, and Miss Amanda Whitford, who's in the Faculty of Law. So you'll be hearing from all of us very shortly, but before we get into the discussion, I want to just briefly introduce the program. So as I mentioned, this is 6858, which is the Bachelor of Science and Bachelor of Law. So this is a very unique program in Hong Kong and globally in that it's both science and law. So why do we need this? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but one of the primary reasons is if you look globally and you look at the total number of patents, for example, in the US or China or Japan, they're increasing globally. There's a real demand for technology, innovation, and to do that requires both a strong background in science and law. The Hong Kong government has actively promoted innovation and technology, as well as technological transfer and entrepreneurship. And so there's a great demand both in Hong Kong and abroad to groom a new generation of students who have strong science skills and also law skills. So Ryan, would you like to discuss further?
Sure thing. Thanks, Dr. Boembrink. So again, thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk really briefly about some of the different career options that this dual degree program prepares students for. So it's difficult for me to do because there are so many intersections really between law and science, and everywhere these two fields intersect, there's the possibility for not necessarily a new type of career, but strengthening one's role within an organization. So intellectual property is probably the most prominent of these and the most obvious. And this could mean being an intellectual property lawyer, somebody who works in an intellectual property office. We call those a patent examiner. You could also be a patent agent, someone who helps someone get patents, or you could be a scientist who helps your organization know which of your inventions are patentable and potentially legally valuable. So there's a whole host of value one could bring to organizations just in that intellectual property sphere. But there's all sorts of other areas where law and science intersect, where students from this program, graduates from this program, could go on to bring a lot of value. So criminal lawyers, for instance, we might not think of them as the most scientifically adept individuals, but a lot of criminal law deals with cutting edge questions of science, questions of forensic evidence. And so having a scientific training will help these future criminal lawyers do their job better and add value to the teams of lawyers which increasingly try these sorts of cases. Environmental lawyers it's another area of the practice of law where understanding the science that underpins the rules and regulations can help an attorney do his or her job. And then an area I think that might not be obvious to many people is what we call in-house attorneys in the world of law. So this is a very common career practice for attorneys where you work in-house for a large corporation. So you might work as an attorney at Google or Facebook or for Tesla or something. And those attorneys oftentimes work their ways up the hierarchy of the organization to very high levels of management. And I think many people would agree with me, that having both a STEM training and a law training will make graduates of this program much better situated to advance high in the hierarchies of these organizations that increasingly rely on science and technology to do the business that they do. To show you just how broad the very varieties of intersections are in science and law, we have a couple of speakers today who are going to talk to us about something called conservation forensics, which frankly, if I'd been whiteboarding this and trying to imagine all the different intersections, this one wouldn't have come to me, but it's really fascinating. So we have Dr. Carolyn Dingle with us. She's an evolutionary ecologist who works on behavioral studies with genetic analysis to understand the processes that create and maintain biodiversity. We also have Amanda Whitford, who's on the law faculty here, and she's a leading scholar of animal welfare, and she works with the government of Hong Kong and sits on the special legal subcommittee advising Agricultural and Fisheries and Conservation Department on animal-related law and policy. And so we have a few minutes of them to sort of talk about the intersections that they see within their own field of science and law. So I have a couple questions just to kick you two off. So maybe Dr. Dingle, can you tell us a little bit about what conservation forensics is, just for the students and frankly for me in the room, so we can understand it a little better?
Yes, sure, of course. And actually, it's a term that we made up within our group, combining two different fields. So conservation forensics, our group came together as an initiative about 5 or 6 years ago. And we were a group of professors at HKU who became increasingly concerned about the wildlife trade that we were seeing. You know, Hong Kong is a hub for international wildlife trade, and particularly for illegal trade. And we began through many different discussions with colleagues to realize that we had tools as scientists that could be used to apply to help enforce this illegal trade. So conservation forensics it's a combination of conservation biology. So where conservation is about working to help save endangered species or stop species from becoming endangered. And forensics is just like what you might see on TV on crime shows, right? We using scientific evidence to help provide data to solve these crimes and law. And so, yeah, so conservation forensics is really about using our scientific tools and our legal tools and data tools to help provide evidence that can be used in court to help enforce some of the laws about illegal trade.
Great, thank you. That's super helpful. Ms. Whitford, can you tell us maybe a little bit about what inspired you to work in this area where there is yet another nexus between law and science?
Sure, thanks. I am a criminal lawyer, basically, and I prosecute, and I also work, as you mentioned, on animal welfare, but I also work on wildlife crime. And in both of those fields, animal welfare and wildlife crime, I'm looking at criminal law through the lens of what can be proved at court. And it made it important for me to understand the science behind both animal welfare, and there is a lot of science as to what animals need. In fact, I have an MSc in animal welfare science because I realized I needed it to advance my career. And I also started to work with the forensics lab on wildlife crime because I noticed that a lot of the cases that were going to court in Hong Kong were not going to court with as much evidence as they should have in order to enable them to be prosecuted effectively. So with wildlife crime forensics, we were able to help the government and the prosecution team to carbon date forensically, to tell whether something was pre or post convention, whether it's legal or not, or to tell if something's captive bred or wild caught, which also makes a difference as far as conservation law is concerned. So there are a lot of ways that as a lawyer, you benefit from understanding science. And that was a field that for my work, I needed to understand better and I needed to collaborate on. And that's why I work with the Conservation Forensics Lab at Hong Kong U.
Great, thank you. Maybe back to you, Dr. Dingle. Do you think that students who could take a program like this, where they get both a BSc and an LLB, could bring value both to a field like conservation forensics, but maybe generally more other similarly intersectional fields of law and science?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've discovered working in this field is that, you know, as scientists, we're producing data. That's what we're trained to do, and we can produce, you know, high quality, useful data. But it's no good to anybody if it sits in our labs or in an academic paper somewhere. And so, by collaborating with Amanda and other teams, we can make sure that that data gets to the people who can actually do something with it. And so, a student that goes through this program and is trained both in science and law will understand both the types of, well, specifically for forensics, but widely applicable, both the required science, what kind of data is needed in court and how do you produce it? And then working with understanding the law, you can understand how does that need to look in order to be admissible in court. So we can produce data, but if it's not produced in a particularly rigorous way, it may not be admissible in court in the end. So going through this program and having the science background, so you understand how the data is generated and understanding the law and what the requirements are to admit that data into court, I think that would provide a very strong training in both of those fields. And whether you went on to do science or law, you would be very well placed to understand the other side.
Great, thank you. Maybe one more question before we move on. We have yet another career talk after this, but Ms. Whitford, I wonder, you've got some really fascinating experience working closely with policymakers and legislators. And I'm wondering, may put you on the spot a little bit, but if you could think of ways that your own personal expertise in both law and having sort of scientific interest and training have helped you bring sort of synergistic value to those interactions, because you've been a very influential figure in the field here in Hong Kong. And I've got to think part of it's due to your unique area of interest and expertise.
Yeah, a couple of things that I've been able to do by having the background in science was, one, I sit on an advisory committee, as you mentioned earlier, which means that my expertise as an animal welfare scientist, as well as a lawyer, is able to influence the kind of policy and legislation that the Hong Kong government passes, because I have that credibility. But the other way that I have affected the way that animals are treated in Hong Kong is through my Species Victim Impact Statement project that I run with Caroline at the Hong Kong U School of Biological Sciences. And we provide victim impact statements for endangered species to judges and prosecutors so that they better understand the effect of wildlife crime on highly endangered species. And that's led to a 2,000% increase in the kinds of sentences that are given for that kind of crime, because we were able to show the science in a way that was legally admissible and understandable by lawyers, because we brought the science brain and the legal brain together in a way that hadn't been done before in our courts.
That's a great example. Thank you so much. You're not only bringing the science and the law, you're also bringing a bit of psychology, maybe to the judicial psychology, showing them the data in just the right way. Okay, thank you both so much for sharing. I think that's a really nice example for our prospective students about the wide variety of intersections that are in these two fields. I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Bonebrake, who's going to lead the next area of career study for them. So back to you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think we're trying to provide some of the diversity of pathways and topics and areas that you can cover within this unique program. And to, again, show some other diversity, I'm delighted today to have Professor Lee, who is going to talk a little bit about his patent experience. So Professor Lee, please.
You have to unmute.
Oh, sorry. I just tried to share my screen. Can you guys see it?
Yeah, all good, thanks.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you, Tim. And yeah, the invitation tried to share with you kind of our experience as a scientist in the university and why we need to file a patent and how that goes. Right? So I just try to, in the next 10 minutes or so, I was trying to share with you my views for the protection of intellectual property. So I guess many students sitting here, probably you're interested in both sides, right? At least you're interested in science and also probably explore the career as a lawyer. So you probably want to know what does the scientist really do every day in a university? You know, we're doing research. As scientists, actually, in most of the time, we just follow our interests and the curiosity to explore the nature. And this ultimately will expand the boundary of human knowledge. But during this process, to explore the nature, we also develop new methodology, technology. And as a chemist, we also actually invent or also create a new substance. Those will help us to understand the nature. So when come up with those new things, technology, tools, as well as the new substance, we hope our intellectual property can be protected. So I actually have many examples, but today I just want to share with you one small example. So in my lab, we're actually interested in to explore the secret of life. So when we talk about the secret of life, this molecule called DNA must be talked, right? So now we all know DNA is our genetic material, really determine who we are. And actually, in the last century, the most important biology discovery is really focused on this molecule. For the discovery of a DNA double helical structure, and also the central dogma of molecular biology, as well as how the genetic code is deciphered. Basically, it tells you, well, our genetic information, which is encoded into DNA, can be transcribed into RNA, then finally translated into proteins. And in a cell, the DNA is the template, which can finally generate proteins, which are the main player of our life. So then we have this idea, I think the human has this idea, so if we understand the DNA, we could better understand the life, because people believe DNA is a blueprint of life. So that's also the reason in 1990s, the whole world coordinate to have this human genome project, just trying to sequence the human genome. Because people believe the DNA is a blueprint, and gene can determine the aging and also determine disease. So if we understand the genes, we understand the DNA sequence, we could better understand disease. And also for the genetic analysis, provide diagnosis, and also nowadays personalized medicine. It's really become the foundation. So it's actually after collaboration between dozens of countries, and also the more than 15 years efforts. For the first time, we know the thing, we can really read the sequence of our DNA. I think the world is really celebrating this moment, because now we understand the DNA, we understand the life. But actually, very soon after that, people realize, although DNA is believed to be the blueprint of life, but there's many things cannot be explained. For example, how to explain our individual difference, especially that's the case for the identical twins, which have exactly same DNA sequence, but they can look very different. Okay, an easier example will be, so when you look at all of us or come from couple of embryonic stem cells, and after differentiations become the different type of cells in our body, blood cells, bone cells, nerve, and the skin. Right? They look very differently, and they actually function very differently. But don't forget, they all have exactly same DNA sequence. So when the DNA as blueprint cannot explain those very simple biological questions, there must be some mechanism behind that, which actually could require something about the DNA, about the genetics we call epigenetics. It's not just basic fundamental biology, but it's also linked to our health issues, because in most cases, DNA mutation will give cancer, will cause cancer. But actually, even sometimes DNA without mutation, the normal cell could also become cancer without a change of DNA sequence. All of those require the new understanding about our DNA, which is about the DNA. So soon the time and the other magazines and scientists realize, oh, why your DNA isn't your destiny? There must be something, some other factors control this process. So this come up with this so-called epigenetic theory. Basically, let's talk about our DNA is not naked. They actually wrap around the protein complex called histone to form our chromatin. So when you consider gene, you don't just consider the DNA, but you also need to consider the protein around which the DNA wrapped, so which is called histones. And the biologists find that on histones, there's any different chemical modifications could happen on histones. And those modifications could regulate almost all the processes templated by DNA, such as DNA replication, gene transcription, and DNA damage repair. So how does chemical modification really regulate those processes? And as I just want to show you, it's really fantastic. Different type of chemical modifications illustrated here. They all control our gene function. But how that happens? So later people realize different modifications, just like different mark. They mark different region of DNA that give the signal for open, close. Basically, it's a turn on or off our gene transcription. But those modifications, just like a molecular switch, they can switch on or switch off. They determine which gene should be expressed and which gene should be silenced. This modification on histones really control the gene function. So in my lab, we really dance at the interface. So you can see here, right? So it's really the interface of the chemistry, the chemical modification, and the biology, which is gene function. So in my lab, we dance at the interface of chemistry and the biology. On one hand, we're trying to understand, we unravel the chemistry behind the biological observations. On the other hand, we also develop new chemical tools, try to understand, explore new biology. So during this process, we have had lots of discoveries and inventions for the chemical tools to understand biology. So one example I want to share with you is how we developed the first class of inhibitor for the East domains, which is potential therapeutic agents for the acute leukemia, the blood cancer. So actually, some times ago, we find actually there's one special modification on histone, which is called protonylation, but it doesn't matter. But when this modification label or mark this genomic loci, it can recruit its readers, the reader to recognize the modification, bind to this modification, and more importantly, they can translate this modification into meaningful biological processes. In this case, the reader called its domain could actually switch on signal for oncogenic gene expression. In other words, they can promote cancer, this cancer promoting gene expression, then they will give the cancer generation. So the simple idea is if we can inhibit the interaction between this reader and the modification, then we could switch off the oncogenic gene expression. So in that sense, we tried very hard as chemists, try to develop small chemicals that can inhibit interaction between the reader and the modification. And at the end, we indeed find a great inhibitor which can function in the cell, can enter the cell and really disrupt the interaction between the its domain and the modification, as make it as a potential therapeutic agents for the leukemia in this case. So when we had this chemical, this new chemical, we're excited because we have the potential probably treats the very aggressive cancer. So on one hand, this is so-called MLL, the mixed linkage leukemia, is very aggressive blood cancer with poor prognosis. And also despite the availability of advanced treatment methods on the acute leukemia, the cure rates for MLL still be very low. And on the other hand, we also see the market values because the leukemia therapeutics are really valued $6.3 billion US dollars in 2010. So both of those make us think, okay, this kind of intellectual property need to be protected if we want to really do further development and commercialization. So then we start a very long way, try to file the patent to protect this IP, right? So start from our side, we develop a new tool. We have the new compound. It works great in the cancer model, but we need to make it become a legal document. It's really a long process. We go back and forth, try to discuss with our patent attorney and try to make them understand how important, how novel this discovery is. And they also try to help us understand in what kind of language we could really document it and file the patent. So as I said, it's a long process. And during the process, the issue is we always have the communication barriers. When we talk about this histone inhibitors, histone epigenetics, and the mixed leukemia, and those very fancy chemicals newly developed, you cannot find literature on this, right? So we speak the language, maybe our patent lawyer do not fully understood. And also, on the other hand, we also have the issue to understand the concerns raised by our patent attorneys, because this communication barrier really makes us suffer a lot. But during the process, we also learn a lot. At that time, we also really hope there's somebody could really help us. Right? But I mean, the Hong Kong USTTO officer did a lot of great job. But just saying, well, indeed, there's a gap between the scientists and the patent lawyers. So I guess, put a long story short, after we filed the patent and maybe find this new chemical identities, and we filed the patent, 3 US patent and world patent are now filed, then still didn't stop us to publish those exciting results to the societies that are able to know this important development. And after filing the patent, we got a lot of reaching out from the industry. The big pharma start to interest in our discovery and try to see what kind of collaboration or development we could do. So at the end, I just want to let you know, so I guess it's always have this gap between the academia and the law. I guess you guys interested in this double degrees really could help us to fill that gap. Right, so maybe I can stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue into the program. So I think with these discussions, we have a good sense for the need for this particular program. So I'll just talk a little bit about the actual details of the program, so what the program entails, so everyone has a sense for it. So this is a 5-year double degree program. So it is a Bachelor of Science and a Bachelor of Laws. So it is both. And that's why it requires 5 years rather than a traditional BSc, for example. And so it's a scientist and a legal professional. So with this degree, you're both, right? So you can become a scientist, or you can become a legal professional, or you can become both. And so part of the program is also combining those two things in a way that links interdisciplinarily the skills of both science and law. So the key features are, this is the first of its kind in Hong Kong. There's no other program quite like it. And we are aiming to cultivate both legal and scientific mindsets. This feeds into the development of STEM talents. And so as I mentioned, this is a big need both in Hong Kong and in the region and globally, and to cope particularly with the soaring demand of patents and legal professionals, particularly within the technology industry. So what does the program cover? So I mentioned, of course, there's key foundational legal concepts that have to be covered based on case reading, legal research, writing, statutory interpretation. There's also key experiential learning opportunities within law. And in terms of science, there's scientific knowledge and research skills that could involve lecture, laboratories, workshops, etc. And then, of course, there's a really important part of the program is doing both. So there are courses and experiences that link both of those things in an interdisciplinary way. So this is the basic breakdown of the credits. So there are 96 credits within science, including disciplinary and capstone courses. There are 156 credits in law. So there's a little more technical aspects within law that are required. So it's a little more. And then general university education, which is 36 credits. And then I mentioned those interdisciplinary electives, which are 12 credits. So in terms of what the program provides, we're looking really for transferable skills, to equip you with transferable skills and things that can lead to articulation. So extensive subject knowledge and specialized training in law, scientific literacy, coupled with that legal knowledge. One of the big exciting parts of this particular program is there is eligibility to apply for the PCLL after completing the double degree program. And so with this degree, students can apply for positions in postgraduate programs in either law or science. Okay, we have a question. Does the program require a lot of memorization? Well, I think there probably is memorization, as I think most courses are, but that's rarely the focus. So we are definitely looking for transferable skills, conceptualization, and maybe someone from the law faculty can talk about the memorization aspect.
Yeah, I can chime in a little bit. The degree of memorization required in the law is generally quite low. It varies class to class. Because we, as lawyers, what we're teaching you to do is to think like a lawyer, to be able to figure out what the legal issues are and how to answer those legal questions. And that's always by referencing the law. Nobody expects you to hold the entirety of the law in your mind. So generally speaking, there's relatively low memorization requirements because that's not one of the key skills we see attorneys needing in practice.
Okay, we also have a question. So would this program be suitable for someone who is looking for science, but not particularly law? For example, looking for a degree in medicine after graduation. Does anyone want to try to answer that?
I think if you're not interested in law, you probably shouldn't do this program because law is a significant part of the program, and the law degree, the LLB, is a difficult thing to do. It's intellectually very challenging, and so if you're not interested in it, your time is probably better spent, doing other more appropriate pre-med training.
I would certainly agree with that.
So there's a question here about whether or not the participant can take math or statistics as the science major. Dr. Bohnbrake, can you talk a little bit about that? You guys have there's a decision analytics or something program, isn't there, that they could potentially take?
Yes, so that there are, I believe, yeah, it should be, I think any of the majors within the science faculty could be taken as part of this program. So that would include math and or statistics. And certainly within statistics, there's a lot of interest and an application with respect to legal.
Absolutely. I teach a legal data science class, and I try to convince all of the young would-be attorneys that learning statistics is going to be a really helpful thing in their careers. So it would be a great option, actually, would be to major in something that is really statistically oriented as well as the law, because you'll get a really interesting mixture of skills.
All right, we have a question. I'd like to know if there are any specific law modules that we have to choose, or can we choose any law modules available?
So the answer there is a little complicated. Law is because it's a professional degree, it's somewhat regulated by the professional organization. So there's quite a few required courses that students need to take in order to become lawyers. So there's less flexibility, I would say, as a rule in the law program than in many other programs, because to take the PCLL, which is the professional qualifying program here in Hong Kong, you simply have to have completed a variety of different core classes in the LLB. So there is room, obviously, for some electives, but there's a lot of core classes that one simply needs to take to become an attorney.
We have a question. I'd like to know if there's an additional bonus for those who attend the interview. Yes, a bonus point will be awarded to those who perform well in the interview. So there's a question, may I know whether students in the program are allowed to take majors from other faculties, for example, geography from faculty of social science? I don't know if there's any explicit exception for that. However, it would be very difficult because of the emphasis on science and law. There's a lot of credits. There's a lot that needs to go in to doing both those degree programs. And so again, I think if you were interested in geography, major in geography, then you might want to think of a different major.
There's a question up a little higher that I think we may have missed, and I don't know the answer to it, but maybe you do, Dr. Bohnbrake. It's when will the interviews be held, and can the students change their program choices after DSE results are released? Do you know?
Yes. Yeah, so the interview will be held before the release of the HK DSE results. And yes, you can change your choice after the release of the DSE results.
questions might have dried up in the chat box there.
Any other questions? Any questions for the speakers? Maybe I can ask Professor Lee, you mentioned about the difficulty of communication. And so I was wondering if a student who is in this double degree program, if they could have that kind of lab experience, and then also the legal background and how that might help to bridge that communication barrier.
Yeah, I think it definitely helps. It helps a lot. They really need somebody who really understands science and also legal issues that really could bridge this. So I guess it's also, when Ryan mentioned, this is definitely one of the career path for those students.
Yeah, in some jurisdictions, to be a patent agent or to work in a patent office, you're actually expected to have substantive training both in law and in the scientific field. It's quite common. I know a lot of my research is on the USPTO, and almost everyone who works as a patent examiner at the PTO has usually an advanced degree in science and then also legal training on top of that.
Yeah, I still remember my postdoc lab mates in the US. After a postdoc, he took a law degree and become a patent lawyer. So it's really common. Yeah. And I think there's really a benefit for this double degree, because you don't have to, decide what's your career path at this moment, right? If you're interested in science and you want to become a pure scientist, this degree still give you didn't shut down that door, right?
Absolutely. I think it's hard to understate how valuable it might be for people who work in science, and then a lot of people who work as scientists then move into management. It's not uncommon at all. You might work in a pharmaceutical firm and move into management, and there's a disproportionate number of C-suite executives that have legal training. It's very, very common, and a program like this would help people, I think, move up the ranks of the hierarchies of those STEM-based organizations very well.
Yes, I wish we had this program when I was a student.
I can answer, there are a couple questions about the admissions, so I can address those. So there are questions about the interview. That will be held in late June or early July. And there was a question about the expected score of the program. The expected score is 49. I have a question about the conservation forensics research. So the species impact victim statements. What do you think is the biggest scientific need with respect to that particular project, and how could this program sort of fill those gaps?
Shall I answer that, Caroline? Yeah, look, in order to write a species victim impact statement, for example, for a pangolin, the most trafficked mammal in the world, you need to understand how many pangolins are left, where they live, what kinds of ways they are used by people who poach them from the wild. You need to understand what their role is in the ecology of the environment that they exist in, what will happen if they're removed from that environment. Are they predators? What are they predators of? These are all science questions. So in order to write those species victim impact statements, I actually have research assistants who are ecologists rather than lawyers. And those research assistants do the fundamental work in determining what we should put into the species victim impact statement. And then Caroline looks at the work and determines whether it's right. And then I look at it and determine whether it's admissible in a court of law, and think about how I would present that case, and do I have the answers to the judge's questions. So there's a great deal of multidisciplinary tasking going on when we develop these statements, and the science is the core of it. Frankly, they couldn't be done without the scientists, because you can't get up in a court of law and say that person had in his suitcase 50 of the last 200 of these animals left in the wild, unless you actually know the science. So it has to be done by scientists at the first level.
Great, thank you.
I was going to add a quick point about the communication that you asked David as well. Like, I think a program like this could really help. One of the things we always come across is that scientists, we talk in our own language and lawyers talk in their own language. Sometimes when we sit together, it's very difficult to communicate sometimes across those boundaries. So a program like this would really help a student to understand and bridge that gap somewhat and be able to interpret the language across the boundaries, so to speak. And I think the fact that Amanda and I work together, and Amanda has a training, I have no law training, but the science training, we're able to communicate across that boundary, and it makes for an effective action coming out of that.
It's a very different way of thinking. Scientists think in terms of, they look for patterns, whereas lawyers look for differences. So it is an entirely different way of approaching an intellectual question. And having both those skills is really beneficial to any kind of work that you could want to do where those two disciplines meet one another.
Okay, I think this will be the last question. If I'm interested in law and ecological biological sciences, but not so much about chemistry, do you think that this program would still be suitable? I think it would be. So yes, you can major in biological sciences. You might have to do some chemistry, but certainly I think there's still, as we've been learning today, a lot of different applications and within chemistry, within biology, within these different science subjects. And so I think there's a broad number of pathways for this particular program.
Yeah, definitely. Well, not just chemistry creates new things, right? Biology also have, nowadays, most of those big pharma is actually pursuing the biologics. So this biology reagent to cure disease. So yeah.
Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you for coming today. And we appreciate your time, and maybe we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.